She was the quiet girl in seat 14A until the pilot collapsed and the radio cried, "Mayday." Emma had always been a quiet girl, the kind who sat at the back of the classroom, never eager to draw attention to herself. She wasn't shy, just content with being unnoticed, keeping to herself while quietly observing the world around her. It was how she preferred life, simple, peaceful, without complications. Today was no different. As she sat in seat 14A on the plane to Denver, she settled into her seat, her eyes glancing at the small window beside her. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the sky. It was a scene that made her feel calm, like she was entering a peaceful world high above the noise and bustle of everyday life. The flight was smooth, typical of the many she had taken before. She didn't often travel for work. Emma was a librarian at a small-town library, living in a quiet community where people knew each other by name. But this trip was different. She was on her way to visit her brother, who had recently moved to Denver for a job. They hadn't seen each other in months, and although she missed him, Emma wasn't quite sure how to bridge the distance that had grown between them over the years. Still, she looked forward to the reunion. She had her headphones on, listening to the quiet hum of the plane's engines, her eyes lazily flicking between the clouds and the tiny screen in front of her. The man in the seat next to her was sleeping, his head resting against the window, while the woman on the other side flipped through a magazine. It was the kind of flight where no one spoke much, each person lost in their own world. Emma preferred it that way. The flight attendants moved down the aisles with practiced efficiency, offering drinks and snacks, but Emma barely noticed them. She had her usual tea, settling back in her seat to read a book, the steady rise and fall of the plane's motion lulling her into a kind of calm trance. Everything felt perfectly ordinary, nothing extraordinary was happening, and that was exactly how Emma liked it. She relished the quiet, the simplicity, the routine of it all. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, Emma thought about the days ahead. Her brother had suggested going to some trendy restaurants in the city, and maybe even checking out the local art scene. She wasn't sure if she'd be interested in that, but it would be nice to be around him again, to have some time away from her usual routine. Emma hadn't realized just how much she needed a break until she booked this trip. Lately, everything had felt a bit too much. The long hours at the library, the endless requests for help from patrons, the quiet evenings at home, it was all starting to feel repetitive. Maybe a change of scenery would help. She turned her attention back to the sky outside. The clouds below her were vast and endless, their soft white formations stretching across the horizon like an ocean of cotton. The sun was now completely set, and the darkening sky began to shimmer with the first stars of the evening. There was something mesmerizing about it all. The peace of the flight, the beauty of the world outside, it made everything feel still. Emma didn't notice the shift at first. The humming of the plane changed slightly, as if the engines had started to work harder, but she didn't think much of it. After all, planes had to adjust their speed and altitude from time to time, right? She kept reading, distracted by the pages of her book. But then the flight attendants started to move more quickly. Emma saw one of them pass down the aisle, her face pale, her eyes wide with something close to fear. "Excuse me," the flight attendant said softly to the woman next to Emma. "Please remain seated and keep your seatbelt fastened." Emma glanced up, sensing something was wrong, but the woman in the next seat didn't seem to notice. The flight attendant's voice had been calm, but there was an urgency beneath it that Emma couldn't ignore. She lowered her book, the first twinge of unease crawling up her spine. She noticed other passengers shifting in their seats, whispering to each other. The plane's motion had become less smooth, the gentle hum now slightly jerky. Something was happening. Emma instinctively checked her seatbelt, making sure it was securely fastened. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where the cockpit door was slightly open. The flight attendants were no longer walking with their usual confidence. They were moving with purpose now, almost hurried. One of them was speaking urgently into a small radio. Emma's heart began to race as the truth began to settle in. This wasn't just a normal delay. Something was wrong. She turned to look at the man beside her, still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the growing tension in the air. The woman on the other side of her had noticed too. Her eyes were wide, her magazine forgotten in her lap as she scanned the cabin. Then the announcement came over the intercom, shattering the uneasy silence. "This is your captain speaking. The voice was calm, but there was a hint of something forced in the tone. "We've encountered a minor issue in the cockpit. Please remain calm and we'll update you shortly." Emma's breath caught in her throat. A minor issue? The woman next to her looked at her with wide eyes, then back at the flight attendants who were now speaking quickly, exchanging hurried words. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening was far from minor. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, like a sudden pressure in the air. The plane jolted, a hard bump that made everyone in the cabin flinch. Emma grabbed the armrests, her heart now pounding. The plane had dipped slightly, then corrected itself, but it felt off. The calm atmosphere from earlier was completely gone. Passengers began to murmur nervously. The flight attendants, usually the picture of composure, were now visibly tense. One of them appeared in the aisle, speaking to a few people in low tones, her voice barely audible over the noise. "Stay calm, please, we'll get through this." Emma's pulse quickened. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew it was serious. The feeling in her gut had shifted from unease to full-blown worry. She glanced at the window again, seeing nothing but a dark, empty sky. Outside, there was nothing to indicate that the world was anything other than calm. But inside, the air was thick with tension. A few moments later, the plane jolted again, harder this time. There was no mistaking it now. The plane was in trouble. Emma's thoughts raced. What was happening? Why weren't the flight attendants speaking more directly? Why hadn't they told them exactly what was wrong? The intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice came through, sounding distant and faint. We've had an issue with the pilot." The captain's voice was strained, cut off in places. "We need assistance. Please remain in your seats." Emma's mind went blank for a moment. The pilot, what kind of issue? And then, before she could think any further, the intercom crackled one last time. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday," the captain's voice said, desperate and clear. "This is Flight 3410. We need immediate assistance." It was a word Emma had only heard in movies. Mayday. She had heard about it, read about it, but never thought she would ever hear it spoken on a flight she was on. The realization hit her like a cold wave. Something was seriously wrong. The words "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" hung in the air, loud and clear in Emma's ears. Her heart raced as the plane jolted again. She glanced around the cabin, her mind still struggling to process the gravity of the situation. Passengers were no longer casually reading or chatting. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, eyes wide with fear. The flight attendants, once so calm and composed, were now visibly anxious, speaking in hushed tones as they moved quickly between seats. The woman sitting next to Emma had started to shake, her hands gripping the armrests as though her life depended on them. Emma wanted to say something comforting, to reassure her that everything would be okay, but the words stuck in her throat. She had no idea if everything would be okay. No one did. Emma's own body felt like it was made of lead. Her hands were clammy, her mind foggy with confusion and fear. She couldn't stop thinking about the captain's voice on the intercom, shaky and distant. The plane was in trouble, serious trouble, and she couldn't do anything about it. She was just one of hundreds of passengers, helpless, with no training or experience in handling emergencies like this. Her eyes kept darting toward the cockpit door, hoping to see the flight attendants moving with urgency, making things right. But instead, she saw one of them standing by the galley, speaking to the co-pilot in quiet but hurried words. The co-pilot was seated in the cockpit, his face pale, his hands gripping the control yoke. He looked every bit as shaken as the rest of the cabin. A sudden thump shook the plane, followed by a loud hiss, like the sound of air escaping somewhere. Emma's heart skipped a beat and the passengers around her gasped, some covering their mouths in fear. The plane tilted slightly to one side, then corrected itself, but the discomfort was clear. Emma could feel the pressure in her ears, the tension in the air. Something was terribly wrong, and every minute felt like an eternity. The plane's intercom came to life again, and Emma's eyes snapped toward it. The voice of the co-pilot, sounding strained but trying to remain calm, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We have encountered a mechanical failure in the cockpit, and our captain has fallen ill. We are currently trying to regain control of the aircraft. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We will update you shortly." The voice was as steady as he could make it, but Emma could hear the fear beneath the calm words. She glanced out the window, hoping to see something that would calm her racing thoughts. But the sky was pitch black, and the only thing visible was the blur of lights below them. There was nothing she could see to give her any sense of reassurance. The woman sitting next to her gasped again, clutching Emma's arm with surprising strength. Emma was startled but didn't pull away. The woman's wide eyes were full of terror, her lips moving but no words coming out. Emma felt the weight of the woman's fear, and she understood it all too well. The situation was out of their control. The only thing they could do now was wait. In the rows behind them, the murmurs grew louder, punctuated by the occasional cry or sob. The flight attendants were trying to reassure people, but their calm voices couldn't quiet the fear that was spreading like wildfire through the cabin. Emma noticed that some of the passengers had begun to pray, their hands clasped tightly, their faces etched with worry. Others were frantically trying to get a signal on their phones, as though calling someone might somehow make them feel safer. Emma's gaze shifted toward the front of the plane, where a small crowd of flight attendants had gathered around the galley. One of them, a woman with short blonde hair, was speaking urgently into a headset, her brow furrowed in concentration. Another flight attendant, a young man with dark hair, was walking down the aisle, his eyes scanning the passengers for any sign of trouble. The quiet girl in seat 14A, who had once been content to disappear into the background, now felt an odd sense of responsibility settle over her. Her mind was spinning, but a strange clarity cut through the fear. She had been in situations where she had to stay calm, during a school fire drill or when helping a lost child at the library, but nothing like this. This was real. The plane was in danger and people needed someone to step up. Without thinking, Emma unclasped her seatbelt and stood up. Her legs felt shaky beneath her, but she forced herself to move toward the front of the plane. She wasn't sure what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't just sit there anymore. People were panicking and she couldn't sit idly by. It wasn't in her nature, not anymore. She walked down the narrow aisle, careful to keep her balance as the plane tilted again. Some passengers looked up at her, their faces a mix of fear and hope, as if seeing someone move with purpose gave them a sense of reassurance. Emma tried to offer them a small smile, but it felt weak and unconvincing. She was just as scared as they were. She didn't have any answers, but at least she could try to do something. At the front of the cabin, she found a flight attendant talking with the co-pilot. He was still trying to communicate with air traffic control, his fingers flying over the controls, adjusting dials and pressing buttons. The flight attendant turned when she saw Emma approaching. "Are you all right?" the attendant asked, her voice tight with concern. Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'm fine, I want to help. What can I do?" The flight attendant studied her for a moment, her eyes scanning Emma's face as if searching for some sign of reassurance. "You're calm, that's good. We need all the calm we can get right now. Stay with me. I need to check on the other passengers." Emma nodded again, her throat tight with fear. She wanted to do something useful, but she didn't know what. The flight attendants were the ones who had the training. They knew what to do in an emergency, didn't they? As the minutes stretched on, the situation didn't improve. The plane's shaking continued, the descent becoming more noticeable. Emma could feel the air pressure increasing, a sense of weight pressing against her chest. The intercom crackled once more, and the co-pilot's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for an emergency landing. Please remain in your seats, fasten your seatbelts, and follow all instructions from the flight attendants. We will do our best to bring the aircraft down safely. Please stay calm." Emma's hands gripped the armrests tightly as she returned to her seat. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat louder than the last. Her mind kept returning to the captain. Where was he? Was he okay? The thought made her stomach churn, but she pushed it aside. There was nothing she could do for him now. The focus had to be on the landing. She needed to stay calm for herself and for the others around her. The woman next to her had stopped shaking, but her face was pale, her hands still trembling in her lap. Emma reached over and touched her arm gently, trying to offer some comfort. "It's going to be okay," Emma said, her voice sounding much steadier than she felt. "We're going to make it through this." The woman nodded, but Emma could see the doubt in her eyes. Everyone was afraid. How could they not be? The minutes seemed to drag on, each one filled with tense silence broken only by the occasional announcement. The plane's descent became steeper, and Emma could hear the engines working harder. She could feel the pressure building again, but she focused on the steady rhythm of her breath. In, out, in, out. She tried to block out the noise in the cabin, the murmurs, the soft cries, the prayers. She forced herself to concentrate, to focus on the fact that they were going to land. They had to land. She just had to keep everyone calm to help them get through this. They were all in this together, and they had to hold on to that hope. Emma was going to do whatever it took to help them make it through. The moments stretched endlessly as the plane descended, the engine's roar reverberating through Emma's entire body. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing on her chest, the fear in the air thick like a storm cloud. The uncertainty of it all made her heart race, and the strange sense of helplessness that had gripped her earlier began to fade, replaced by a strange sense of determination. Emma gripped the armrests tightly, her knuckles turning white. She wasn't the kind of person who liked to stand out. She wasn't brave. She had always preferred the safety of being unnoticed, of blending into the background where she didn't have to face fear head-on. But in the last few minutes, something inside her had changed. Her instincts had kicked in, and she found herself thinking not about her own fear, but about the people around her, the passengers who were scared, the flight attendants who were trying to keep everything under control, the co-pilot struggling to bring the plane to safety. Her mind raced, her hands trembling as she thought back to the few first aid courses she had taken in high school. She remembered the basics: checking for breathing, applying pressure to a wound, staying calm in an emergency. None of it was anything that would help in this exact moment. There were no wounds to tend to, no obvious injuries. But the principle was the same. Remain calm, help when you can, and keep everyone focused. Emma turned to the woman next to her, who was still holding onto the armrest, her face pale with fear. She gave her a soft, reassuring smile, trying to calm the woman's nerves. "It's going to be okay," Emma said again, her voice steadier than she felt. The words didn't feel convincing, but she knew she had to say them. The woman nodded, her eyes not fully convinced but grateful for the effort. Emma could see her eyes flickering to the flight attendants, who were now speaking with the co-pilot in quiet, hurried tones. The co-pilot was still at the controls, but his face was drawn, his brow furrowed in concentration. Emma couldn't imagine the pressure he must be feeling. He was in control of a plane with hundreds of people depending on him, and yet he was still trying to make the best decisions with limited resources, and a captain who was unconscious, unable to help. The sound of the intercom crackled again, and the co-pilot's voice filled the cabin, still sounding strained but trying to reassure everyone. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot again. We are doing everything we can to ensure a safe landing. Please remain calm. We are in contact with air traffic control, and we will update you as soon as possible." Emma's heart thudded in her chest. The panic was still there, simmering under the surface. She could hear people whispering, some beginning to pray under their breath, others glancing nervously at the windows, as though searching for something, anything, that might make them feel safer. The turbulence had lessened slightly, but the plane was still descending, the pressure of the situation increasing with every passing second. Emma's gaze shifted back to the flight attendants. One of them, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes, approached Emma and whispered softly, "Can you stay with the others? Help keep them calm. We're doing everything we can, but we need as much help as we can get." Her voice was tight, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she spoke. Emma nodded quickly, her heart racing. She didn't know how she could help, but she knew she couldn't stand there frozen, doing nothing. She was here now, and she had to step up. She took a deep breath, then stood and began to move down the aisle toward the back of the plane, where passengers were shifting nervously in their seats. Some were whispering, some were silent, their eyes wide with fear. The air was thick with anxiety, but Emma knew that the best thing she could do right now was to be a calm presence in the storm. She approached the first row of passengers, where an elderly couple sat. The woman's hands were shaking as she gripped the armrests, her face pale. Her husband, beside her, was looking out the window, his face tense, but he didn't seem to be responding to her anxiety. Emma stopped beside them and gently placed a hand on the woman's arm. "Everything will be okay," she said softly, trying to make her voice as reassuring as possible. "We're all in this together, just stay calm." The woman's eyes met hers, and for a moment Emma saw the fear there, the same fear that Emma herself was feeling. But she also saw something else, a flicker of gratitude, a tiny, fleeting moment when the woman realized she wasn't alone in this. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice shaky. Emma nodded and moved on. She didn't have time to dwell on it. She continued down the aisle, speaking to passengers one by one, offering a few words of reassurance. Some of them were too scared to even acknowledge her. Others clung to her words like lifelines, nodding with tight, strained smiles. She kept her voice calm, her tone steady, trying her best to be the anchor that the others needed. As Emma moved through the cabin, she noticed that more and more people were starting to follow the flight attendant's instructions. The seatbelt signs were on, and everyone was securely fastened in their seats. The last-minute panic that had filled the cabin earlier had started to subside. Passengers were settling in, preparing themselves for whatever would come next. Emma returned to her seat, the weight of her actions settling on her. She wasn't doing anything extraordinary. She wasn't saving lives with grand gestures or heroic acts. But she was doing something, and that was enough. She was helping people stay calm when the world around them was anything but calm. It felt good to have a purpose, to feel like she was contributing, even if just in small ways. She glanced toward the front of the plane again, where the flight attendants and co-pilot were working together, their voices hushed but urgent. Emma's thoughts returned to the co-pilot. He was still at the controls, still fighting against the chaos, still trying to make sure they would land safely. She couldn't imagine how exhausted he must be, how overwhelmed he must feel. She knew he needed every bit of support, every ounce of strength that the passengers could offer. As the minutes dragged on, the descent became more pronounced. The plane tilted slightly, and Emma felt her stomach churn with the change in pressure. She forced herself to focus on the task at hand, staying calm, helping others, breathing deeply. The co-pilot's voice came through the intercom once again, this time more urgent. "We're approaching our emergency landing site. We will be descending rapidly. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. Do not attempt to leave your seats until instructed." Emma's heart skipped a beat. They were going to land. The uncertainty had been unbearable, but now, at least, there was a plan. They were going to do everything they could to bring the plane down safely. Everyone had to hold on. Everyone had to stay calm. As the plane continued its descent, the lights in the cabin flickered. Emma glanced at the windows once more. The ground was becoming visible, the bright city lights below giving her a strange sense of connection. She wasn't alone. None of them were. The final moments were a blur, but Emma focused on the people around her. She reminded herself to stay calm, to keep breathing, to offer a sense of peace to those who were still afraid. There was nothing else she could do now except wait. Wait for the landing. When the plane finally touched down with a hard thud, the collective gasp of relief that went through the cabin was almost deafening. They had made it. They were safe. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to exhale for the first time in what felt like hours. She had done it. She had been a small part of something much bigger than herself. And in that moment, she realized something that would stay with her forever. Sometimes it's not the grand gestures or the heroic acts that make a difference. It's the quiet moments, the small acts of courage that have the power to change everything. The sudden jolt of the plane, as it touched down, filled the cabin with a collective gasp. The sound of the wheels skidding across the tarmac was deafening in the otherwise silent cabin. For a brief moment, everything was still. Time seemed to stretch as the passengers held their breath, waiting for the final moment when the plane would come to a complete stop. Emma's heart was racing, her chest tight with the effort it took to remain composed. She could feel her pulse in her throat, a constant reminder of the fear that had gripped her through this whole ordeal. The plane's descent had been turbulent, every second full of uncertainty, but now, finally, it was over. They had made it. She glanced out the window, her eyes scanning the bright lights of the airport ahead of them. It was a surreal sight, an airport she had only seen from the air before, now looking strangely close. There were emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, their lights flashing in a rhythm that seemed to echo the beat of her own heart. The plane slowly came to a halt, the screeching of the brakes still echoing in her ears. The engines began to quiet, the hum of the plane dying down, leaving behind a tense, heavy silence. No one moved for a long moment. Passengers were still strapped into their seats, their eyes wide, their bodies stiff with a mix of relief and lingering fear. Emma remained seated, her hands still clutching the armrests, her knuckles pale. She had done everything she could. She had tried to be calm, to help others, to offer reassurance. But now, with the plane safely on the ground, she felt the exhaustion begin to settle in. It was like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, but the effort it had taken to stay calm, to keep everything together, had drained her. Her body felt heavy, and her mind was foggy with fatigue. But despite the overwhelming exhaustion, she allowed herself a small, quiet breath of relief. The intercom crackled again, the voice of the co-pilot coming through, sounding both exhausted and relieved. "We have landed safely, and emergency crews are here to assist. Please remain in your seats while we prepare to disembark. We will update you shortly." Emma closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. The plane was on the ground. They were safe. She let out the breath she didn't realize she had been holding, feeling the tension slip from her shoulders. But even then, she couldn't shake the lingering feeling of what had just happened. It had all been so sudden, so unexpected. She had never imagined she would be sitting on a plane one moment, quietly reading her book, and then, in the next, be thrust into the role of helping keep strangers calm during an emergency. The cabin began to stir as passengers slowly unbuckled their seatbelts, their movements stiff and careful, as though they weren't entirely sure they could trust that they were really safe now. Emma could see some people still clutching their bags, others looking around, their faces pale but filled with a sense of gratitude. The woman who had sat next to her, still wide-eyed and trembling, caught Emma's gaze and nodded slowly, her lips pressed together in a silent thank you. Emma offered her a small, reassuring smile in return, her heart still beating too fast, too erratically for her to feel entirely calm. But the smile was genuine. They had made it. That was all that mattered now. The flight attendants, too, were starting to move around the cabin, their usual professionalism returning. They walked the aisles with a renewed sense of purpose, checking on the passengers, making sure everyone was all right. Emma watched as one of the flight attendants, the woman with short blonde hair, spoke briefly to the co-pilot, her voice low, but filled with the gratitude of someone who had just witnessed a small miracle. As the plane sat on the tarmac, the emergency vehicles that had been waiting on the runway slowly began to approach, their lights flashing in a slow, rhythmic pattern. There was no sense of panic now, just a quiet, almost eerie calm. The danger had passed. The crew had done everything they could. They had managed to land the plane safely against all odds. The tension in the cabin began to fade, but the sense of uncertainty still lingered in the air. No one could quite believe that the worst was over. Not yet. The moments had been too intense, too close for anyone to feel completely secure. But the plane had made it safely to the ground, and that was all anyone could ask for. The flight attendants moved quickly now, guiding passengers toward the exits, their voices calm but steady. Emma stayed in her seat for a few more moments, watching as people slowly made their way toward the exit doors. No one seemed in a rush to leave, their movements slow, as though they were all still processing what had just happened. Some passengers were already on their phones, calling loved ones, others simply sitting in their seats, their heads buried in their hands, as if the relief had come too suddenly for them to fully comprehend. Emma finally stood, her legs shaking from the tension of the past few hours. She grabbed her bag from the overhead compartment and made her way toward the exit, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath her feet. She moved slowly, taking in the faces of the other passengers as she passed. Some were still in shock, others smiling faintly, as though they couldn't quite believe they had made it through. When she stepped off the plane, the cool night air hit her like a rush of fresh air. The airport, though busy, felt eerily quiet compared to the chaos of the past few hours. She took a deep breath, letting the coolness fill her lungs. The sharp, sterile scent of the airport mixed with the scent of the fresh air outside, grounding her in the reality of what had just happened. As Emma made her way toward the terminal, she glanced over at the emergency crews, still standing at a distance, their bright lights flashing. The sound of distant sirens filled the air, but the noise didn't feel as threatening as it had before. The danger was over. The crisis had passed. She found her way to a seat in the terminal, her legs still weak from the shock of everything that had happened. It wasn't until she sat down that she realized just how drained she felt. The relief was there, but it was tempered with exhaustion. The adrenaline that had kept her going through the descent, through the landing, was now beginning to ebb away. As she sat there, her hands resting in her lap, she replayed the events in her mind. The plane's sudden shift, the captain collapsing, the chaos that followed, it all seemed like a dream, a strange and surreal sequence of events that she could hardly believe had happened. But it had. She had been there in the middle of it all. And in that moment, Emma realized something she hadn't truly understood before. She had acted. She had stepped up when others were too afraid to move. She had stayed calm when the world around her was falling apart, and in doing so, she had made a difference. It wasn't anything grand. It wasn't some heroic act that would be remembered for years. But in the midst of all the panic and fear, she had been the one to keep people calm. She had been the one to offer them a glimmer of hope, and that, in itself, was enough. The intercom crackled again, the voice of the airport staff now coming through, thanking everyone for their cooperation and assuring them that they would be taken care of. Emma sat back, closed her eyes for a moment, and let out a long breath. The storm had passed, and for the first time in hours, she finally felt like she could relax. She had made it through, and so had everyone else. The silence in the terminal was deafening as Emma sat there, her mind still racing from the events of the past few hours. The overwhelming rush of emotions, fear, confusion, relief, began to settle, but it left her feeling utterly drained. She had never expected to find herself in a situation like this, to be thrust into a role of responsibility when she had always been the quiet observer, the one who stayed in the background. Yet here she was, surrounded by other passengers who had experienced the same terrifying ordeal, all of them now trying to process what had just happened. The sudden shift in the atmosphere from tension to relief was almost surreal. The fear that had once gripped her and everyone else on the plane had dissipated, but it had left a lingering sense of disbelief. How had they made it through? Emma couldn't quite believe it herself. She kept replaying the moments in her mind, the sudden chaos when the captain collapsed, the panic that followed, and how she had somehow managed to remain calm when everything seemed to be falling apart. It hadn't been easy, and she knew she hadn't been the only one who had tried to stay focused, but the fact that they had all made it through, that the plane had landed safely, felt like a miracle. As the minutes passed, the terminal began to feel more like a normal airport again. The announcement over the loudspeaker informed passengers that they would be escorted to the baggage claim area, and that anyone needing assistance should go to the customer service desk. Emma, still feeling shaky, decided to follow the crowd and make her way toward the baggage claim area. She wasn't in a hurry to leave. There was no real rush, but she wanted to get out of the immediate chaos, to find a quiet spot where she could collect her thoughts. She picked up her bag from the carousel, the simple act grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. It was just a bag, a regular part of any trip, but now it felt heavier than it should. She held it close, her fingers gripping the straps, as though it might anchor her back to some sense of normalcy. As she walked through the terminal, she couldn't help but overhear bits of conversation. Other passengers, still trying to process everything, spoke in hushed tones about the flight. Some were telling their families about what had happened, while others were exchanging phone numbers, now that they had shared such an intense experience together. Emma overheard one man telling his wife that he had never been so scared in his life, and the woman nodded, her eyes still wide. Emma couldn't help but agree. It had been a terrifying experience, but there had been something almost comforting in knowing that they had all made it through together. Everyone had contributed in their own way, whether it was through staying calm or supporting each other through the uncertainty. She found a quiet bench near the exit and sat down, her mind still buzzing with the intensity of the flight. She had never been a hero. She had never sought out attention, nor did she think of herself as brave. But in that moment in the middle of the panic, when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control, she had acted. And now she realized she had done something important. She had been part of a team, even if she hadn't planned it that way. The flight attendants had been trained for emergencies, and the co-pilot had done his best to guide the plane safely. But in that small, fleeting moment of chaos, it was the collective calm of the passengers, of everyone working together, however quietly, that had made the difference. She had been one of those people, and that realization filled her with a quiet pride she hadn't expected. Still, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in her. She had always been content to stay in the background, to remain unnoticed. But now, she realized that it was sometimes in those unexpected moments of crisis that a person's true strength came to light. She had stepped up not out of a desire for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do, and that had made all the difference. As she sat on the bench, Emma took a deep breath, allowing the air to fill her lungs and clear her mind. The loud hum of the airport had become a familiar sound now, and the crowd around her, once so overwhelming, now felt like just another part of the routine. There were still people around her, speaking to each other, catching up, and laughing about the ordeal. But Emma, though grateful for the safety of the plane and the calm that had returned to the airport, felt a need for solitude. She needed time to process everything, time to understand the part she had played in this unexpected adventure. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. The flight had been delayed for quite some time, but she had already texted her brother earlier to let him know that she had landed. He hadn't replied yet, but she knew he was probably just as shaken as she was. It would take time for everyone to fully come to terms with what had happened. She glanced at the screen and decided to send another message, a simple update letting him know that she was okay, that she had survived the ordeal. Her phone buzzed in her hand, and Emma looked down to see a reply from her brother. "Are you okay? I'm so glad you're safe. Can't wait to see you. We'll talk more later. Love you." A small, comforting smile spread across her face as she read the message. Her brother's words were simple but meant the world to her in that moment. She typed back a quick reply, her fingers moving over the screen with ease. "I'm okay. I'll tell you everything later. Love you too." The message sent, and Emma slipped her phone back into her bag, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The ordeal was over, but the memories of the flight would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't just the fear that lingered. It was the sense of connection, of shared experience, that had come from a situation that had, at first, seemed like an unimaginable nightmare. As she sat there, watching the people around her move with purpose, Emma realized that this experience had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. She hadn't been the same quiet girl who boarded the plane earlier that day. She had seen fear, faced it head-on, and come out the other side with a new understanding of herself and the world around her. The world hadn't changed, not in any dramatic way, but Emma had. She had stepped up in a way she never thought possible, and she had done it without thinking about what it meant or how others would see her. She had simply acted because it was needed, and that act of courage, however small, had made a difference. She stood up from the bench, the final remnants of adrenaline leaving her body. The fatigue from the ordeal lingered, but Emma felt lighter now. The uncertainty that had gripped her heart during the flight had faded, replaced with a quiet confidence that she hadn't known she had. It was time to move forward to embrace the journey ahead. She walked toward the exit of the terminal, her steps steady and sure. It was time to meet her brother. The worst was behind her, and she knew that, no matter what lay ahead, she could handle it. She had already faced the storm and come through it stronger. And that, in itself, was enough. As Emma walked through the terminal, the sounds of the bustling airport around her began to filter back into her awareness. The loud hum of voices, the clatter of rolling luggage, the distant announcements echoing through the speakers. It was all so normal, so ordinary compared to the chaos of just a few hours ago. She could still feel the weight of what had happened, like a lingering fog that hadn't quite dissipated. But with each step she took, it became easier to breathe, easier to accept that the worst was behind her. The world outside the airport had returned to its usual rhythm, but Emma felt strangely removed from it. It was as if she had crossed an invisible threshold, one that separated the world of routine and normalcy from the world of uncertainty, fear, and survival. She had faced a crisis, had played a role in helping everyone stay calm, and had made it through. But now, as she walked through the terminal, the enormity of what had happened was slowly starting to sink in. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. This time it was a message from her mother. "Emma, I heard what happened. Are you okay? Please call me when you have a chance. I'm so relieved you're safe." Emma smiled as she read the message. Her mother had always been a worrier, and Emma could already picture her pacing around the house, anxiously waiting for news. She typed back a quick response. "I'm fine, Mom. Everything's okay now. I'll call you soon." Her mother's reply came almost instantly. "Thank goodness. I've been praying for you. I'm so proud of you. We'll talk soon." Emma's smile grew wider as she tucked her phone back into her bag. Her mother's words were a comfort, and she felt a small sense of pride. Despite the fear and the exhaustion she felt, there was a part of her that had changed, a part of her that felt stronger and more capable than she ever had before. And it wasn't just because of what she had done during the flight. It was also because of how she had faced her own fears, how she had stepped up when everything around her seemed to be falling apart. As she walked to the baggage claim area, she passed other passengers who had been on the flight. Some were talking in hushed voices, still processing what had happened, while others were simply staring off into space, their faces pale and distant. Emma caught the eye of one of the flight attendants, a young man with dark hair who gave her a small, grateful smile. It was the first time he had looked at her like that, and she could see the unspoken gratitude in his eyes. They had all been through something together, something that had tested them in ways they hadn't expected. But now it was over, and they had made it through. Emma's mind wandered back to the plane, to the moments when she had felt helpless, when she had questioned whether she could keep her composure. But she had, and now, as she stood in the terminal waiting for her luggage, she realized that she had learned something about herself. She had faced fear head-on, and rather than running from it, she had chosen to confront it. And in doing so, she had helped keep others calm, had kept them grounded in the face of something they couldn't control. The baggage carousel started to turn, and Emma joined the small crowd of passengers waiting for their luggage. The hum of the machines, the familiar rhythm of the conveyor belt, it was all so mundane, so everyday. But Emma's mind was far from mundane. She was still processing everything that had happened, still trying to make sense of the strange mix of fear, relief, and pride that swirled inside her. When her bag appeared on the carousel, she reached out and grabbed it, feeling its weight in her hands. It was just a bag, nothing special. But to Emma, it felt like a symbol of everything she had just been through, of everything she had learned about herself. She slung the bag over her shoulder and headed toward the exit, the bright lights of the airport casting long shadows across the floor. She could see the city outside, just beyond the glass doors. The world was still spinning, still moving forward, despite the fact that she had just experienced something that had shaken her to her core. She had never imagined that something like this would happen on her flight, but now, as she walked out into the cool night air, she realized that life was full of the unexpected, and it was how you handled the unexpected that truly mattered. She pulled out her phone again, this time to call her brother. She had already texted him earlier, but she hadn't spoken to him yet. The message she had sent him earlier had felt like a small reassurance, a way to let him know that she was okay. But now she wanted to hear his voice, wanted to tell him everything that had happened. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Hey, Emma, you okay? I've been waiting for you to call." Her brother's voice came through, a mixture of relief and concern in his tone. "Yeah, I'm good," Emma replied, trying to keep her voice light. "Everything's fine now." "I can't believe it. I've been hearing reports about the flight. What happened? Are you sure you're okay?" Emma leaned against the wall, feeling the exhaustion settle into her bones as she began to recount the events of the flight. She told him about the captain's collapse, the panic in the cabin, and how the co-pilot had tried to regain control. She told him about the moments when she had stood up to help, to reassure the other passengers, to try and keep the panic from spreading. She told him about how, in the end, they had all made it through together. "Wow, Em," her brother said, his voice filled with awe. "I'm so proud of you. You really stepped up. I don't think I could have done that." Emma smiled, a small, tired smile. "I didn't really think about it. I just did what felt right in the moment." "I know, but that's what makes it so amazing. You didn't just think about yourself. You thought about everyone else. That takes a lot of courage." Emma let his words sink in, and for the first time since the flight, she allowed herself to feel that sense of pride she had been holding back. She hadn't just acted out of a sense of duty. She had acted because she had cared. And in that moment, she realized that caring, truly caring about others, was the foundation of courage. They talked for a few more minutes, catching up on everything, but Emma could tell that her brother was still processing the events of the flight. He was still trying to come to terms with what had happened, just as she was. But in that moment, it felt good to know that someone understood, that someone else was there to share this experience with her. After they hung up, Emma stood outside the airport, the cool air refreshing against her skin. The night sky stretched endlessly above her, the stars barely visible against the city lights. It felt like the calm after a storm, and for the first time in hours, Emma felt at peace. The events of the day had changed her. She had stepped into the unknown and emerged stronger for it. And as she looked up at the sky, she realized that this experience, this challenge, would stay with her forever. It had shaped her in ways she hadn't expected, and she was proud of the person she had become. The night was still, the world continuing on as it always did. But Emma knew that, from this moment on, she would never be the same. She had faced fear, had acted when it mattered most, and had come out the other side stronger. And that was something no one could take away from her. With a deep breath, Emma turned and walked toward the car waiting to take her to her brother's house. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time she felt ready to face whatever came next.